Hi, I'm Jo Heinrich, and I'd like to read an excerpt from The Forsaken by Matthias Jügler. I can't get this dark, gripping, understated little book out of my head, and I'd love the chance to translate it and share it with a wider audience. This excerpt is from near the beginning of the book, where the narrator tells us about the last time he ever saw his father when he was just 13. We drove to a Chinese restaurant in Amendorf and had lunch, with Coke as well. I had expected my father to carry on talking during the meal. He didn't. We were the only customers, and we ate in silence, and I didn't know why. I didn't know why I wasn't in school that day, nor why he'd taken me to that restaurant. It wasn't like him. I looked at him as we were being served our desserts. I was still angry. I wanted to ask what was up, but he beat me to it, asking, "What is it? Don't you like it?" The question made no sense, as I hadn't touched my dessert yet. Even he realised it, and we laughed, although it wasn't that funny, only a bit. But it felt good to be able to laugh with him, and I noticed my anger had died down. Suddenly, my question seemed unreasonable. What's the big deal, I thought. Why not skip work and school and have a good time just for once? So I said nothing. We ate up, he paid, and we left. Father had sometimes seemed odd to me. For example, when he'd sit in the kitchen after work, doing nothing for hours on end. He always looked as if he was waiting for someone, but no one ever came. On those evenings, I'd go into the kitchen, we'd nod to each other, and I'd say something like, "I fancy a chocolate milkshake," or "I'm still hungry," because I felt the need to explain myself. And then he'd say something like, "Yes, why not?" or "Yes, good idea." We parked outside my grandmother's apartment in the south of the city, in a 5-story building with windows I thought were much too small. Even in the summer, my grandmother's apartment was so dark you had to put the light on. She didn't seem at all surprised to see us. She hugged me first, and then my father. I'd already taken off my shoes and was waiting for him to do the same, so we could go and sit in the living room as usual, drink a coffee and a chocolate milkshake, watch some TV, and have a chat. But my father didn't take his shoes off. He stood there by the front door, looking at me in a way I didn't like. My grandmother went into the living room and closed the door behind her. "Come here," Father said, still by the door. When I got close enough, he pulled me briefly and tightly into an embrace, and then he pushed me back a little and held me by the shoulders. His eyes unsettled me, although I didn't know why. "Take care, my boy." He went down the stairs, and I heard the main door slam shut. The TV was on in the living room. I waited for a minute, or maybe 2, my eyes fixed on the doormat in front of me. Eventually, my grandmother came out of the living room. She didn't say a word about my father going, but she was holding a bag of sweets. Twice previously, I'd been in hospital. A broken arm when I was 8, and a fractured kneecap just a few months later. Both times, when my grandmother came to visit me, she'd put a big bag of sweets on the bedside table. "To make me feel better," she'd said. When I saw her then, with the bag in her hand and a pitying look in her eyes, that was the moment I realised he wasn't coming back. I began to cry. I would much rather have been angry with my father, as angry as I'd been in the morning, but I wasn't. It was only hours later that I composed myself. I got under my grandmother's covers. She gave me a sandwich and afterwards a handful of sweets. Then she made some tea, the sort she drank to help her sleep. I asked her where he was and when he was coming back. She said he had to go away for a while, but he'd be back soon. She looked over my shoulder as she spoke. It wasn't hard to tell she was lying. But I said nothing. I drank my tea and ate a few sweets just to please my grandmother, as they really didn't taste good this time. It was still light outside when I fell asleep. From then on, I lived with my grandmother. In the first few weeks after my father's disappearance, I kept asking the same questions. Why can't I just go home and wait for him there? When will he come and pick me up? My grandmother was cagey whenever she answered. He wouldn't be on his business trip forever. She was sure he'd ring soon. The words business trip often came up in those first few weeks, whenever we bumped into neighbours or acquaintances while we were out shopping, or if I was crying in bed and my grandmother was trying to make me feel better, which often happened around that time. But I knew, as well as she did, that my father wasn't on a business trip. Thank you for listening.